I'll start. I'll just do a quick introduction of myself. And then, Jeff, I'll hand it over to you, and then we can just kind of jump right into the battle. I mean, not really the battle, but kind
Yeah.
of like you said. Hey, everyone, I am Kerri McKinney. I'm super excited that you're here. I have been working in the tech space and recruiting for over 10 years. I worked for companies like PayPal, Indeed, .com as well as Amazon, where I led recruiting teams and participated a lot in hiring. So, really excited to be here to kind of share tips and tricks of just things that I know can help you hopefully ace the interview process. And I'm really excited to be here with Jeff because he's like an interview genius who knows much more about interviewing than I do. So I think it'll be a really good conversation.
Thanks so much, Kerri. I appreciate that. I think our backgrounds are both going to be exciting for this audience. And I think and I'll just prompt as people come on, if you can mute, that would be amazing. And I know it's not set up that way, so it might take a second. Um, I think most of the people here probably know one of the, or two of us or both of us. My name's Jeff H. Sipe. I run a business called practiceinterviews.com. So we do negotiation coaching. We do practice interviews. And then I just released a course on Thursday, or sorry, today's Thursday. I released that on Tuesday. And so if you stay to the end, I'm going to be offering a discount for anybody who stays to the end on that course. And my background is I'm hitting about 15 years of recruiting experience, and 5 of those years were spent at Google. And I'm here to share some of that knowledge because the Amazon and Google worlds are both incredibly complex and challenging in their own ways, and definitely matching towards different personality types. So I think Kerri, we can kick it off. I don't know, maybe I feel like you're going to be the lead today. I'm putting that in your corner, so kicking it right to you.
Well, I do want to add, while this was targeted, Google versus Amazon, I think these are great tips regardless of where you interview. I personally feel like when I interviewed at Amazon, it was just a really good interviewing experience. Like I learned so much. So even if you don't think you're ever going to interview at Amazon, you're ever going to interview at Google, I think everything we're going to go through today can really, will be a takeaway for regardless of where you go interview. Um, so, Jeff, what do you think are the biggest differences when it comes to interviewing at Amazon versus Google? Because I think they both have their own, you know, precise ways of doing things.
I agree. I agree. I mean, I think the number one thing that pretty much everybody knows is right. Amazon is a behavioral shop, right? You are going to come in, you are going to get crushed with behavioral questions, and Google's more of a 50-50, right? It's much more leaning towards half open-ended and half behavioral. And there is actually also a nuance in how you answer behavioral questions at Google as opposed to how you answer them at Amazon, in terms of length of time, I's versus we's. So there's a lot of interesting items. And just want to kick it back to you, Kerri, in terms of that behavioral component. What are some of the areas you think that candidates should be focusing in on the behavioral side that might be a little bit different at an Amazon versus maybe another company?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think most people, if you have ever had any interest in to interview at Amazon, you know about the STAR method. So you got to follow the STAR method. If you don't follow the STAR method, it's almost a guaranteed way to not move forward. So for those of you who aren't familiar, STAR is situation, task, action, result. So you want to make sure you're going through, um, you know, the order of not just the STAR method, but you want to follow the order to spell out the word STAR as you answer. And I think one of the biggest differences is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but at Amazon, you want to talk all about yourself. And that was something that was really, really hard for me because I'm a big team player and I like to talk about my team and the people I work with, but at Amazon, they really want to hear about you and your results and what you did. And so the more that you kind of you want to use I a lot more than you use we, and I think that's a struggle for some people. And I think that's also a big difference than when you interview at Google.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I wanted to cue in on. Everybody, everybody should be using the I. Remember, the key component of behavioral questions, past performance predicts future performance, is in the actions that you specifically took. So we have to be implementing I's. But if you bring in the we's like you would at most other companies at Amazon, they're not going to be quite as happy. So there are two other data points that I want to confirm, Kerri, that I think are really, really important for this audience. I want to talk about the fact of how many examples you think should be prepared for an Amazon interview, and then also how far back they're really willing to let you go. Because I've heard some pretty strong rigidity there, and then I'm going to throw a third one at you too: repeating examples. So let's talk about all three of those items because I think all three are really, really interesting and very, very unique to Amazon.
Yeah. No, those are good questions. So, as far as the number of examples to prepare, I try to recommend at least two for every leadership principle. That can be very, very challenging. It's challenging for me. I don't even truly know if I could do it if I tried to do it right now. And that kind of ties into repeating examples. And you don't want to you want to try to not repeat examples, but I also think that there are examples that you can use for multiple, leadership principles, for example. So, maybe think big and dive deep. You had to think really big to to be successful in this project, but you also had to dive deep and do a lot of digging to think big. So I think you're always going to have instances where you can use multiple ones, but you want to be able to tailor it in a different way for each person. Um, I remember when I interviewed, I used the same, and I was terrified to use the same example with two different interviews, but I gave them a heads up and I said, I can't help but share a similar or the same example that I did when I spoke to so and so because I just feel like it's very relatable. But I changed up how I told the story a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And I
Um,
think, oh,
Sorry.
go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I think a lot about when you are interviewing at Amazon, you really do become a storyteller. It's not so much just Q&A. I mean, you really want to tell the story, and that's why I tell people, when you go over the situation that you're going to explain, you need to try to take the interviewer there and help them envision the situation. So you can't just say, well, at my previous company I was working on this team. Well, what's the previous company? What was the team you were working on? Things like that, I think, is just really, really important to make sure that you include.
Yeah, so let's talk about how far back, because here's the most common data point I hear when going into the Amazon interviews coming from recruiters is they're telling candidates to not go past 2 years, to only go back 2 years into their career. I've heard that many times, and I just want to confirm how there's now 16 principles. So I got to have 32 examples, all from the last 2 years, that are all supposed to be interesting enough. Like, how is that even possible?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. Um, I would say, try to keep it within 4 years, but you also have to take into consideration the different positions you were at. I mean, if you were at the same company for 10 years, like, yes, you're going to have to figure out examples from that company alone, and you want to try to keep it within the 4 year range. But if you worked at multiple companies, um, if you have like a killer example that's from 5 years ago, I mean, do it. Like, figure out how to tell the story in a really great way and own it. And, I don't think it hurts to even say, well, this was 5 years ago, and I know that's not ideal, but I'm really proud of this example, and so I want to share it with you. And I think the more that, the more you can embrace that and don't be nervous having to do that, I think that'll help a lot, because at the end of the day, Amazon wants to see that you prepared and um, that you know your stuff. And I think that would trump the fact that your example is a little bit too, a few years back than you want it to be.
Okay. Yeah, I tell people to cheat on that one a little bit. They're
Yeah.
like, what year was that? Oh, it was a few years ago. Because I always was telling my clients basically, try to keep it as relevant and recent as possible, but also try and sneak those other ones in just because of the pure difficulty of trying to have that many examples. And I can think of like 3 work examples total, so it's really, it makes it super, super challenging to have that amount of examples, the diversity of examples, etc. And the
Yeah.
repeatability thing, I think, is interesting because I think we should maybe talk a little bit about this. One of the things that you were kind of calling to attention is it's like the pivot point, right? So we might have this example where we're asked, tell me about a time you handled a successful initiative. And then the next question is, tell me about a time you had a conflict. And within that successful initiative, you had a conflict. And while the setup is somewhat similar, you're still going to pivot it greatly. It's the same example, but it's not really the same example.
Exactly. 100%. And I saw something. I'm trying to keep up with the chat, but it's not going very well. But I did see someone say, and this is a great question: if we focus too much on I as opposed to we, is there a chance that you'll be seen as not a team player? Should it be a mixture of both? They're going to ask you questions to make sure you're a team player. So I would focus on getting the examples, showing how you're a kick butt worker, and know that you will get a chance to show that you're a team player because they're going to ask you a question about that. So you do want to have a mix of both, but I would really focus on um, the actual leadership principle. For instance, earn trust. You're going to want to have an example where you probably will talk about we a little bit more. But when it comes to ownership, think big, customer obsession, like that's all you. You need to show exactly how you can own that leadership and how you thrive in that type of environment.
Agreed. Agreed. Um, what was our next piece? I know we had some focus areas, but I can't remember what they were. Honestly, I don't remember.
Yeah. And I think I saw one other question I just wanted to address. And again, I'm trying to keep up with them. But if someone has less than 1 year experience applying, you're definitely not going to have that many examples to share, but you're also not going to have the same type of interview that people with 5+ years of experience have. I mean, I don't know, Jeff, would you agree with that when it comes to Google? Like, I feel like just for the level of role that you're interviewing for, I mean, most of the time they take into consideration the fact that they know that you're not going to have as many examples.
Yeah, and I think the most fun part sometimes about being an intern or being a new grad or having 1 year of experience is that you can go back, right? You can go back into school, talk about school projects. Even though I am a work example only kind of person, the reality is that you might need to bring in something extracurricular or some sort of side project just to add to the diversity and actual number of your examples. So you get a lot more flexibility when you're more junior. And I would say the other really important data point for more junior level candidates is that typically at all companies, including a company like Google, it will lean more behavioral the more junior you are. They're going to look for a little bit more example based, in depth, heavy duty problem solving. That's going to be, it's just a little bit of an advanced skill set that comes over time and a lot of practice. So, um, yeah, good things to
Yeah.
consider.
And in relation to that, somebody said something, Jor, fabulous comment in the chat. The better you can tell the story, the easier it is to remember for the interviewer. And it's so true because the interviewer is going to be taking notes and they're going to go talk about your I don't want to say talk about you, but they will talk about you in your debrief. And the easier that they can look at their notes and say, and go down the list and say, okay, here was the situation, here was the task, here was the action, here was the result, you'll get many more brownie points than if they have to go all over their, their notepad or their computer and try to figure out, okay, what was their situation, what was their task.
I think that's a good, let's stay on that for a second, because I think that this is, so globally, the biggest challenge I see on the behavioral side is actually in the beginning, the situation and task. And so, and we can talk about this for forever and dissect these
Yeah.
answers, but one of the key visuals that I work on with my clients is, if you are not creating a very clear visual situation and task, your interviewer is doing this. They're typing and they're thinking and they're thinking, but you're still talking. So they're trying to figure out in their heads what you've actually said and what's happening, but you're moving on. So it's so critical that the visuals are great. And I think just a few key things that I love to highlight in the situation and task, and Kerri already prompted to one of these: establish credibility with your role in company. If you're going to interview for a customer engineer at one company and you're coming into another, this is an example from my time as a customer engineer at Google, and you're interviewing at AWS, it's an immediate credibility. I think really establishing the critical stakeholders, internal, external, or both, in one sentence, and or the industry or type of client you're working with, one sentence on that challenge. Make the challenge very specific and clean and clear. Then set the task and the timeline and let's get down to business. Because remember, the core function of a great behavioral answer is in the actions. And so I'm going to quickly bring in an analogy. I love food analogies because I tried the sports thing and that just didn't resonate with everybody. But if you think about your behavioral answers, think about them like a sandwich. Top slice of bread is the situation and task. Bottom slice of bread is the results, and the middle is the actions. We eat the sandwich for what's in the middle. So the bread is critical. The bread is critical to holding it all together, but we go for the meat, we go for the veggies, whatever we like in the middle of the sandwich. That's why we eat the sandwich. And that's the way you should be thinking about your actions, which we can transition and talk a little bit about actions now, Kerri, if you want. But because I'm kind of going off on a tangent and I'm very caffeinated. So, but we can talk a little bit more about actions, or whatever direction you want to take, or we could look at some of these questions.
No, I want to. Gosh, I feel like we could talk about interviewing at Amazon and Google for like hours. But I do want to touch base on something because I think you hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of people try to kind of skim over the situation and the task and go straight to the action and straight to the result. And I always tell people I work with, when you are practicing your examples, and even when I work with people to help coach them and practice interviewing, I tell them I'm going to time them. And I say, I'm going to ask you a question. I don't want you to pay attention to the clock, but you want to try to get your answer to as close as 3.5, 4 minutes as possible. Because if you give an answer that is 1.5 minutes long, you are not sharing enough detail to cover the STAR method, full stop. And if the person has to continue to dig things out of you and dig things out of you, the feedback is going to be they didn't give enough detail. They didn't seem to know enough about the example that they were sharing. And so, like I said, paint the picture, set the story, share what the task was and why was the task important. I love when I hear someone tell me what the task was and include data, because we all know they love numbers, they love data. But if you can say, our customer satisfaction score, like explain the task, and our customer satisfaction score was this, and it was crappy or something. And then by the end, you can say the result was this, and this is what it is now. Like, music to my ears. So always, always, always try to get that answer to at least 3.5, 4 minutes. They will probably ask you another question to clarify, which is fine. But the less that they have to ask you to continue to dig in on your answer, the better that you know your original answer is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, we could not be more strongly aligned on the time. I always tell my clients 3 to 4 minutes on your answer. And here's the thing, if you look online, 90% or plus of information says 1 minute. If you go over 2 minutes, your interviewer's falling asleep, they're not paying attention. That's for not the elite companies of the world. The elite companies of the world, you're going to have to hit that level of depth that's absolutely critical for success. And 3.5 minutes is actually my sweet spot. And I do the same thing. I time
I'm so
everything my clients.
surprised.
Yeah.
The
So,
lady that I was speaking to,
uh,
Oh,
sorry, just a quick reminder to people to mute. It's okay. Right when you pop on, the mute button's not going to be on. It's totally cool. But I time everything. And so if you could see the setup, it's kind of funny. So like when I talk to clients, my clients and I are a small sliver in the middle. And then on the left-hand side, I have my notes. And on the right-hand side, I have the stopwatch. And I tell them to do the same thing. I say on the left-hand side, just have like 3 or 4 huge reminders in big bold of things you always forget, like repeatability and results, or a great task, or bring in numbers. And then on the right, I say, if you can, stopwatch yourself during the interview. You're not going to get it perfect. It won't be great. But if you can constantly have an idea of how long you're talking, can be really impactful. And of course, use a stopwatch when you practice and prep on your own with friends, because the stopwatch is just like, we get such a good idea. Are we long winded? Are we too short? Or are we finding that really, really nice sweet spot?
yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, being cognizant of the time, do you want to let's move on to a few more of, tackling the interview questions and what they're kind of looking for. And I think as we do that, I'm seeing a few questions around like the key points to mention and then the answers. We can kind of tie that in. Um, so having a backbone. Okay, I think this is a big one. I think this is a tough one because you want to be able to show how you've stood up to something, how you've stood your ground without coming across like a jerk. Go, Jeff. How do you not come across like a jerk?
Yeah, so much of I actually believe that so much of this answer is by pushing back with data. So it's kind of like that Amazon question that's like, tell me about a time you faced a business directive that you didn't agree with. Like, what did you do and what were the results? And so much of it is just like raising your hand and being like, Jane, I don't really agree with that approach. And here are a few initial thoughts that I have on why I don't agree with it, but maybe we can meet after, or you grab Jane after the meeting, or you ping Jane after the meeting. And you're like, look, we need to talk. You have that conversation, and then you go and you back it up with data, your data, other people's data, and then you push, 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 but you agree to ultimately take the direction of leadership. You let your team know that maybe you don't agree with it, but you go with it, but you keep that continual push. And a lot of times, what I see is that people lose in the beginning, but over time, they're kind of validated that they did
Mhm.
actually know what they were talking about and have the right approach. But it's so much of like having the willingness to stand up, but then back things up with data, because I think that tells a good story. Can you
Yes,
guys?
I completely agree. And I think, you know, I'm one of those people who have a lot of opinions and I want to tell people what I think and have a backbone. And I learned quickly in my career that if you don't have the data to back it up, you're not really going to get anywhere. And so I think that's a fabulous point to mention. I also think being able to tie it to the larger impact on the business, right? So how why did you stand up for what you did? Why did you push back? It didn't only affect you. You knew it would affect other people. So let's show how, you had a much larger impact by standing up for something you believe in.
Love it. Yeah, absolutely. Very, very aligned. And I think just one of the things we're talking about Google and Amazon, but as you think about any of these big tech companies and just companies in general, they want to see results with data. and especially the big tech companies, like, one of the biggest pieces of feedback for the team that I made the most hires at Google, this was um, program management within the data center space. And my hiring manager would constantly tell me, be like, Jeff, the candidates aren't showing me how they drove results with data. It's like, okay, I'll give them that feedback, So,
Yeah.
um, so it's a really, really good data point.
And I think you can, and again, like, I feel like whenever I coach people on interviewing, I literally apologize to them. And I'm like, I'm sorry, you're going to hear me tell you to use more data anytime you can, but it's true. And it doesn't matter if you're focusing on invent and simplify or even customer obsession. The more that you can bring numbers into your answer, it's going to help you tremendously. Do you feel like that's the same at Google?
Yeah, so let's talk about the numbers piece because it's a really important piece. You want to create a great visual representation for your audience. Numbers are numbers are the universal language. We all understand numbers, hours saved, percentages, money. So you're getting to this very like common language place with your audience, and common language is just going to make it so much easier for them to understand.
Yes.
So I'm going to bring in the second food analogy of the day. So and sorry, my light's on a timer, so I have the anyway. It's a long story.
That'd be amazing if it just went completely pitch black because your lights are on the timer.
Um, so I always tell candidates. Now, this is a little bit more on the open-ended side, and we probably should touch on that just a little bit because that is the difference. I don't know how we pivot into that, but I always tell candidates, or my clients, don't give me food, give me pepperoni pizza, because food is good. I like food. You like food. We all like food. I want pepperoni pizza. Why? Because it's one of the most consistent visuals globally. Even in places where people don't eat pepperoni pizza, they know what it looks like. And so if you're always getting your audience on the open-ended side or on the behavioral side to that pepperoni pizza place, it means they can picture what you're talking about, what you did, and therefore you've created a great visual. And here's what happens with visuals. Create a visual, you become memorable. You become memorable, it connects your interviewer to you, you get connected, they're more likely to hire you. So pepperoni pizza. I'm out of here.
No, but I agree though. Like, it all goes back to the storytelling and the key things that you want to include in every different piece of your answer. Um, if you you know if you think about, like, we talked a little bit about the situation and making sure you include the backstory, and when you talk about the task, like, make sure you share why is that task important. Of course we all have a task, but how does that task impact the larger business goals or the goals of the team? And when you think about the action, the more that you can truly bring them into the story, the better. um, and then when you get to the results, that's when you want to tie it all back and you want to kind of remind them of the task and why the result that you got to was so important and awesome because of the task that you shared at the beginning. So it truly reminds me of creative writing. Like, you want it to all flow together, but it all does have to connect. And I think that's something that I do see people struggle with is they get so focused on the S. And when I help people, like, I literally will tell them, okay, take a piece of paper and I want you to write down star. And during your interview, I'm not joking, write down star so that you can look and say, okay, I need to start with the task and then flow into, or start with the situation and then flow into the task, but you don't want it to be choppy, right? Like, you have to make sure that you are bringing it all together in this beautiful little package. And I think that's hard because some people get so focused on the S and the T and the A and the R.
Yeah.
I feel like I just went off on a little tangent, but
No, because I love the visuals. So like I definitely tell my clients the same thing. Like have star, and then I like CFAS for open-ended questions, and then just have that. Have that as the reminder because it gives you two critical items. it reminds you of the methodology. And then it also reminds you of the order of things, because the order of things can get a little funky and there can be some jumping into results and then back into actions. I find a lot of my clients have like 2 or 3 minute situations and they tell me this huge story and then they're like, and we executed it and it was great. I'm like, all right, but what did you do? So, um, why
Yeah.
don't we let's I want to try to introduce a little bit on the open-ended side, but I feel like the flow on the behavioral questions is so good, so I don't know what to do.
No, no, I think, no, go for it. I think it's important. I also think that somebody had asked earlier, like, will they tell you that it's a behavioral question? They won't say, now I will ask a behavioral question. You'll know by what they ask. Tell me about a time, blah blah blah. One thing I do want to mention, and then let's kind of shift a little bit to the open ended, but um, the questions at Amazon that they ask, like, they are intense, and I always tell people, and we talked about this, Jeff. You don't want to have examples for specific interview questions. You want to have examples for the topic. So do not ever try to find interview questions and have an example for an exact question, because you don't know if they're going to ask that. Now, when they ask you a question, I tell everybody, don't be afraid to say, thank you for the question. Give me just a moment to gather my thoughts. And then take 30 seconds and write down, okay, here's the example I'm going to use, STAR, really, really fast, and then go. Because these questions are intense. And I know, just like the open ended, your brain needs a few seconds to process the entire story of what you're going to say. So, how would you kind of shift that to the open ended questions?
Yeah, I feel like we should stick on the behavioral side maybe a little longer, because I think we can use a lot of these learnings on the open-ended side, and I think it's a good dialogue, and I don't want to just walk away from it, because you mentioned something right now that's a really good piece. When people get open-ended questions, it's kind of like they know to take their time, but in behavioral questions, it's like the question ends and you're ending, and they're like, and they jump right in. So remember, with all behavioral questions, there's what I like to call a pivot point, where we haven't focused in on the questions, which is perfect. We've focused in on our own examples, but our situation needs to be adjusted slightly. Like, we've prepared our situation and task and actions and results, but there's a pivot point where we just need to like tweak it a little bit and then start our actions from where the question is being asked. Meaning, when people prepare their examples, they're standalone examples, not questions, two questions, which is great. But they have it so planned that they try and fit it all in, and then they're 2.5 minutes in before they start answering the question that was asked of them. We need to restate questions, clarify, make sure the question's clear, and take our time. What is your interviewer going to be doing while you're taking your time? They're checking their email, they're checking the sports score, they're checking the weather, they're checking the menu of the restaurant they're going to that night. They don't care. Now, if they're sitting there like 5 minutes later, they're saying, I answered like 26 emails, then yeah, it's an issue. But taking a little bit of time, and I can't speak for Amazon, but I always tell people about a minute. Take up to about a minute. If you need less, fine. Definitely for open-ended questions. I always tell the funny story of one of my best clients ever. Her answers were unbelievable. She used to take 4 minutes. Some of the best answers I ever heard. And she ultimately got to the very end of the process, didn't get through. She took too long to answer the questions, and it was a lot of the coaching that we went through, but answers were great. But if you take at least a minute, collect your thoughts. Again, a minute on the behavioral side might be a little bit on the long side, but definitely on an open-ended question, I would want to see people taking a minute, because there's massive brain connectivity. And I want to just bring one other data point in here, because we focused a lot on behavioral. And I'm going to do a video on this on Tuesday because it's coming up so much. Use your behavioral answers as fuel for your open-ended solutions, meaning that instead of tell me about a time you disagreed with a business directive, what would you do if you were put in a scenario where you were given a business directive that you didn't agree with? So we just flip it from a behavioral to an open-ended. And in the solution, instead of trying to like rack your brain and say, oh my goodness, what am I going to do here? You just go back to that example and you say, let's imagine we have a scenario where X is happening. It happened to you last week or last month or last year. So you're not saying it happened to me at this time. You're just using it as fuel. You're using it as a way to help your brain ideate through the complexity of an open-ended question.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Because I do think there definitely is, I mean, a lot of crossover. And you can use the same examples, and you should almost keep in mind, keep the star method in the back of your mind when you're answering an open ended question, because it will just help keep your answer flowing better.
Yeah, yeah, because we understand the world through the things that have happened to us. And that's just a
Right.
natural thing. And people are trying to recreate these things from scratch. Okay, so we haven't done enough on actions, I feel like, or results. Somebody threw in there learnings, which is part of my coaching. I have an addition there, which I do not recommend for my Amazon clients. I tell them not to bring in. So I have two additional. I have my method, Kerri. You probably don't know this. I use Starl. So
Star.
STAR is STAR method and then learnings and follow-up questions. But when I coach Amazon clients, I tell them not to use STAR. I tell them to only use STAR.
Yeah, I would only bring that in if it feels relevant enough to the question. Um, because again, when those interview trainers go through interview training, um, they are told to look for a very, very specific way of speaking. Um, and hey, I feel like I need to make this disclosure. I'm not saying I 100% agree with it. Like,
Yeah.
if it were up to me, I probably would be a little bit more flexible with kind of the answers that I take. But knowing what the training looks like, especially when you're a bar raiser, I mean, you are looking for very, very specific format. So I think that's a good call out.
Yeah. And I think the
Um,
rigidity of Amazon is an interesting thing. And I would say that because you're supposed to be interview coached at Google, I'll admit that I somehow got out of it and just they threw me into interviews. I never had to do it. I think I was definitely an outlier. Um, but the other thing is that I think that there's this kind of, there's this idea or concept that these interviewers at these big companies are great interviewers. They're just employees at these companies who are given very, very limited training and they're just going in and they're trying to do their best.
yes.
And I think that that's one other item we should just talk about. There's so many things. This could go on for hours. But the other thing to remember in all of this, and we focused a lot on the behavioral side, but the thing to remember is that your interviewer attention span is very short. They don't want to be there. You are an annoyance, an interruption to their day. And anybody who tells you different is lying. And anybody who's been in here and has interviewed knows that that's the case. The only exception I would say is maybe for a hiring manager who has a very vested interest or a team member who's swamped and really trying to find a great partner. But the vast majority of people don't want to be there. And that's why we need to be so good at the details, so good at the information, so good at the visuals. Because if we can't do those things, they're going to be falling asleep. They're not going to pay attention.
Yeah. No, I unfortunately have to agree with you. And it's not a fun thing to admit, but and especially when you think of the volume that Amazon and Google do, like interviewing, like it is a struggle to find people to do interviews because they have their own meetings, but then they have certain amount of interviews they need to do. And so the more that you can give them what they want and the more that you can keep them hooked with your answer, the better chance you have of being remembered in an interview, because that's what it comes down to, right? Like, they're going to do multiple hours of interviews a day. What are you going to do to set yourself apart? Are you going to be the rock star person who they go back to the debrief and they're like, wow, they nailed the star method? Like, they were just wow. Or are you going to be the one that they're like, they had so much data. they shared so much data, and they had this incredible example of using data to make a significant change. Regardless of what it is, you want to find something that you excel at to be able to set yourself apart from the rest.
Let's stick with that visual because I love these visuals of our interviewers. So this is the one I do. This is your interviewer, Sue, my fake interviewer. Anybody who's watched any of my content knows Sue's my bestie. So Sue's doing this, going crazy, right?
Yeah.
Sue's busy. She's got meetings, she's got other interviews. Sue might not look at that feedback for a day or two. At Google, they're not looking at it for days at a time. You interview on a Wednesday or a Thursday, likely they're not going to touch that feedback till the following week. Maybe they have a boozy weekend. Maybe they just have a crazy weekend with the kids or whatever. If you created really strong visuals, behavioral or open-ended side, they are going to remember you. You
Mm-hmm.
didn't, they're going to be like, oh, they had some meetings and they brought people together and they don't have a picture. So the other thing that you mentioned, Kerri, before was the visuals. So like when you think about some of the most common business stuff, especially when we used to live in a normal world, like the put me in the room thing.
Yep.
Put me in the room. If you met with people, what did it look like? Did you whiteboard? Did you present? Was the product team in there? Was the eng team in there? What were the three epiphanies? What happened in that room? Because
Yes.
otherwise I'm like, great, you met with some people. Big deal.
Yes. I'm so glad you said that. I was just working with someone the other week. We were doing practice interviews, and I kept asking those questions. Well, what other stakeholders were in the room with you? What other teams were you working with? They want to hear that type of stuff. And those are great ways to bring kind of other leadership principles into the one that they're focusing on. Because what you need to remember is when you get asked a question, it is always going to be focused on one leadership principle. But if you can figure out a way to answer a question on thinking big, but bring in some of the dive deep stuff that they would be looking for. And again, I'm going to go back to data because everyone loves data. Um, that's going to be just another bonus. They're going to be like, wow, they were able to really show me how they thought big. Does that even make sense? Thought big. Um,
Mm-hmm.
while using data. Or they were able to show me how they were so obsessed with the customer by using data and digging deep to figure out how to better make the customer happy. So I think that's a great call out. And again, it's that visual piece, and you're not answering a question, you're telling a story. And the more that you can put the person in the atmosphere and in the room with you and make them feel like they work at the company that you were at, the better. And especially because I think when you do that, it also helps them think of examples or situations from their own work history where they've been in a room with other project managers or engineers or marketing, and they're like, oh, I remember when I did that. And then it'll help kind of the visual click.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit. I want to hear from you. I think it's really important. Um, Actions. We've talked a lot about the visual component of actions, but is there any other? I have a couple things that I always like to introduce, but would love to hear from you. What do you tell people to focus in the actions portion?
So for me, I think the biggest thing that comes to mind is the why. Why did you make the actions? Why did you do the actions that you did? Um, because you want to be able to, again, tie them to the task and the result. And you want to be able to show why your actions were needed to get to the result that you ultimately, got to. Um, and I think I always recommend trying to think about it from a larger scale and how it impacts the business, because you don't want to give an example that only impacts you, right? Like you want it to be able to show how your actions impacted the larger team or the larger goals of the business. And it can be challenging, I think, especially if you don't have a ton of work experience, and if you can't think of how it directly impacted the business. I think it's helpful to really think about, in your mind, how did the action impact the business, even if it didn't, this might not make sense, even if it didn't really impact the business, why, how did it click in your mind? Does that make, do you see where I'm going with
Yeah,
this?
yeah. Like what was your thought process that you were going through to make sure that all the
Yes.
dots connected, even if it didn't come to fruition? And like, of course, how did you go about it? What were the data points that you utilized? And not all stories need to have a perfect ending. I think that's the other thing that people don't realize.
Boom. That's like, yes. And being cognizant of time, I know we only have about 5 minutes. Um, that may be a good kind of thing to end on, is talking about failures and non-positive endings. Um, because it's a question that's going to be brought up, and it's a question that gets brought up everywhere, not just Amazon, not just Google. But being able to be humble and honest enough, because if you go into an interview and you can't give an answer of when you failed, they're going to think that, they're not going to believe you, and they're going to know that you struggle to be humble, and we all have those mistakes that we made.
Yeah,
So how
agreed.
do you, would love to kind of hear how you approach that with some of the people you work with.
I go right back to the pivot point, because so many people, it's like, tell me about a time you had a conflict, right? Like the most, or a failure, most common kind of what I would call negative questions that you need to flip and turn positive. But people are like, they spend so long on the setup, and Bob was a jerk, and like all these things happen with Bob and this conflict or failure or whatever, and we're like a minute and a half in, 2 minutes in, and then they tell me about the actions they took with Bob or the actions they took to overcome the failure. I'm like, no, I need to know exactly why you failed right away. Tell me why you failed, and then let's get into the actions. And this is where I do always encourage learnings. Let's talk about the actions you took to overcome the failure, the conflict, the unethical situation. Talk about the results. And this is one of those examples where I strongly encourage people to bring in learnings. And lastly, applied learnings. So it's like, now every time, not only did I learn that you need to do X, but now every time before I start a project, before I talk to Bob, before I do whatever, I always implement this, because applied learning shows that you've not just learned it, but that you're now applying it.
Yes, and that is a great example of when it's okay to bring in the L, the learning at the end of STAR, because that will really tie into the result. You know, you had this problem or this conflict or this failure, whatever your action was of why that happened, and then the result is, this is what I learned. Like, this is what I will never do going forward. And it can be very hard to answer that question, but I think the more that you can go in and almost laugh at yourself and be like, oh, well, there was this time where I just made the biggest mistake ever. Like, you have to, again, you want to own it, because the more that you can own it, they'll be like, wow, that person's very self aware. That person clearly wants to grow and they want to learn and they're not afraid to fail. And while we always want to be showing our best, like, we're also all human. And so the more that we can kind of bring that piece in, I think that can help a lot to help you stand out. Um,
Um,
Especially I think at the, sorry, I should say, especially at the manager level, and you know, the higher L6 and L7, like, they want to know that you can admit failure, because it's easier for them to trust you to lead a team when you're not afraid to admit that stuff. We have 1 minute left. Jeff, I know we're about to wrap it up. Is there anything you wanted to share around? I know you had some really
yeah,
cool.
Gabriella, I don't know if you can come back on and tell us if this is gonna like hard stop us. Is this gonna shut?
No, no,
Okay,
it's not going to shut by itself, so don't worry.
okay.
Yeah.
Kerri, do you have a couple of extra minutes if we run over, or do you have a hard stop?
I have a few,
Yeah,
but
we have,
I do want to be cognizant of everyone else's time too,
okay.
because we did
Okay,
say
cool.
this was 1 to 2. So,
Yeah,
um,
um, so yeah, I want to highlight something. I just want to do a couple things because we didn't really get to it. So I did want to highlight just on the open-ended side. Um, I have a ton of content. I think a few people in here might be aware of me and my content, but the biggest difference that we didn't spend a lot of time on, and Kerri and I could probably, like, we haven't even really dove into the actions or the results, or like, I feel like there's a lot more to unpack there. But just on the open-ended side, the four key items that I want to highlight to everybody for open-ended questions: got to come in and clarify. You have to present a framework, have to make assumptions, because assumptions will create that visual, that specificity. A lot of what we talked about on the behavioral side, you have to create that visual. And then when you solve, you dive deep on one item at a time. And so much of these open ended answers are not organized, and they don't have any depth. And so those are just a couple of really critical items that I wanted to highlight, because without those items, you won't have success. I do want to prompt to an offer, because it's just going to be for anybody who's here and still alive, and we're past the time, so people might be hopping off. But um, to anybody who showed up to this session today, I'm going to offer a 36-hour $100 discount on my course. So the coupon code is GVA, Google versus Amazon, GVA, and that will be available till midnight Pacific tomorrow night. And then that offer will go away. So I just wanted to throw that out here for anybody that was interested. Yes,
amazing.
thank you for that, Kerri. Thanks. So, Kerri, why don't actually let's talk about a couple of other things. I just want to be I always go over, so I'm used to like going crazy. And
I
I want to be respectful. But a couple of things I wanted to talk about just on the actions and results, because we didn't get to them. You know, One of the things that I think is really helpful is to, in the actions, to think chronologically, like in what's normal. Like, normal is doing a deeper dive on the data, thinking about planning, conversations. A lot of people miss the execution and testing component. And then at the end, what is the documentation, launching, presenting? So depending on the question, you might front load those actions, backload, you might spend more time on the execution and testing component. And then the one other thing on results that I love, it's my absolute favorite way to end if you don't bring in learnings: repeatability. You solve for this, and then you tell me that this solved for this, I'm going to hire you, because it's the last thing you say in your answer. So I just wanted to hear your comments on repeatability, because it's like I like jump up when they say something repeatable, because I think it's so powerful and impactful. Throw it back to you.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that that again it just ties back to the why of why you were doing and sharing the example that you are in the first place. Um, so yeah, I completely agree.
Kerri,
Um,
might need to do a round two on this. Ding ding.
yeah, I was gonna say thank you all so much for coming. We didn't even really get to, tackle interview questions, but I'm here if anyone needs help kind of prepping for interviews or you just want to continue to dig deep. But the recording will be sent out shortly after, and keep an eye on our, I guess, LinkedIn's and social media. We'll see if we can maybe get another one of these because it was fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you, Kerri. You're amazing. This was obviously, we're very in sync here, which obviously made for a great conversation. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your
Thanks, guys.
day.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, guys.